For any of you who've been following the blog since day one, you'll have seen a lot of etymologies, literally hundreds. However, while these can be a great source of fun, they can also hopefully lend insights into the way that different languages evolve and diverge, cultures interact, and how even one language changes over time. There are a great number of etymological mistakes, or even flat-out lies, that someone can stumble across. For anyone interested in scoping etymologies for a whole dictionary, or just to double-check something that looks a little fishy, here are 7 steps that you can take to figure out an etymology. Number 1, hit the books. It is sort of impossible to know if something is really the first use of a word. For one thing, sometimes changes are gradual, and as you will know well from English, conventions in the way people spell things does not always equate to how they are spoken. However, just looking at English for a second, big shifts happened after the Norman invasions, particularly in the 12th century, and during the 15th century at the time of the Great Vowel Shift. If you can find a word from then, and then link it to today, that wouldn't have existed before, especially if it's from French or Latin, etc., there's a good chance that this is the first recorded use, or at least a very early one. Emphasis on recorded, though. Step 2. Hit the maps. If it is from a foreign language, which is very common in English, then look to see what is going on at the time. English has a handful of words, for example, from Arabic, but nothing came directly from Arabic to English until fairly recently. When this happens, it is usually that it went through several other languages first, and this is not fast or a simple process, so the sounds will almost inevitably change. Geographic contact is going to lead to words being taken from one language into another, but also keep in mind how contact blends two languages together naturally, but won't if they're too far apart. This is happening now, for instance, when English is in contact with Spanish at the US-Mexican border and sounds change. Word loaning, especially historically, is only from direct exposure, though, to other languages. As mentioned before, sounds are important, and not every word is loaned. Keep in mind that different sounds shift in different times. For instance, English is a Germanic language, but even its Germanic words don't always sound like German. Keep track of how things like W and W or S and T sound different, but are often in the same places between those languages. Take the German Wasser, for instance, which is the equivalent to the cognate in English water. If you aren't mindful of the way that the sounds in a given language change, you cannot follow the history of that word. Some easy ones to remember for English are outlined in Grimm's Law, such as P to B to F, D to F to a theta, like thin, or G to K to X, which sounds like the German H. Keep in mind that this is only for Germanic languages, and even if you look at another language family, there will be different but equally fitting patterns. Number 4. If you are looking at a word, but only part of the word, either how it had changed historically within the same language, or even if it was loaned from a different language, this is probably not sufficient. If you cannot account for at least most of the word you're looking at, that's pretty suspicious. This is not to say that large chunks of words are never tacked on or dropped off, but this is rare, and especially rare to happen suddenly and just to be accepted by the general populace from there. If this happens, or if you see a part of a word that you cannot account for phonetically or historically, be wary. Step 5. Just because something looks similar does not mean that it is. The most famous example could be from the Mbarabam language native to Australia that has the word dog, meaning dog, but this did not come from English or any other language. By comparing the words for dog to that of languages similar to Mbarabam, it was determined this was a native word to the language, and any relation to English was coincidental. This might seem insignificant, but people have tried to relate whole languages to each other on the basis of a few odd pairs of words like this, and it just is not enough evidence on its own. You need to compare the language in question to those that are similar to it, mostly linguistically, particularly with grammar and phonetics, and perhaps also geographically similar. On that note, if two words of two languages are really similar, there's a good chance, despite what I just said, that they could be cognates. This can be differentiated from what I was talking about before, though, if you see the word, mostly phonetically, is really out of place from what you would expect to find in whatever language you're looking at. However, people are very quick to adapt the word they've taken to their native language. So this can be just as much about history as it can about the sounds. Basically, if a word exists that can otherwise not be accounted for in 1, the language's own history, and 2, the languages that are closer related's own history, it's a good bet that it's actually loaned and not just adapted from something older. 7. Storytime. If you see a story about a word that sounds 1, convoluted, and 2, relies on acronyms alone, and or 3, would not explain cognates in other language, there's a high probability that this is just made up, particularly to the last point, because if 2 languages have related words and only one of them is made up by some explanation but not the other, there's an obvious problem. To the other points, stories that are too long often, though not always, were made up for fun, as most etymologies are pretty cut and dry. But also, acronyms produce far fewer words than some people believe. This does happen in sometimes different languages will have different cultural reasons for acronyms, but in the case like posh or bay, where there is a popular assumption that it comes from an acronym, be skeptical of this. And there you have it. You can go off and start your own etymology-focused blog. Please don't though, as I am not built for competition. What you can do if you're a linguistically minded person is to visit the main blog, where there is a new post every day, and to go to the Patreon so that you get more posts and help this channel to be better and grow. I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.